It was a cold November evening when Mark Williams, once a millionaire, now a homeless man, sat shivering in an alley, his future uncertain. The world around him had changed drastically in the last few years. Once, he had owned everything he could desire, a sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills, a luxury car collection, and an empire of real estate. Now, the only thing he owned was the dirty jacket on his back and the cardboard box he called home. Mark's story wasn't one of a rags-to-riches fairy tale, it was a fall from grace that left him broken. He had built his wealth through savvy investments and smart business moves, but one bad decision had cost him everything. An investment in a startup that promised to revolutionize the tech industry turned out to be a scam. The company collapsed, taking Mark's fortune with it. The stress led to a breakdown, and the next thing he knew, he was sleeping on the streets, disconnected from everyone he knew. His wife left him, friends abandoned him, and his name was no longer a sign of power but a memory. But Mark wasn't one to accept defeat. As he sat on that cold, damp sidewalk, staring at the neon lights of the city that once belonged to him, something inside him stirred. He realized that in every failure, there was a lesson to be learned. He wasn't ready to give up, he just needed a new plan. Days turned into weeks, and Mark's life remained a constant struggle. He scrounged for food, picked through trash bins, and spent his nights in shelters. Yet, every moment was a reminder of the resilience he once had. It was during this time, one cold morning when he found himself sitting at a bus stop with nothing more than a cup of cheap coffee, that the idea struck him. Mark started to pay attention to the things others ignored. The way people interacted with technology, the way they spent money, and how the economy was shifting. His mind, still sharp despite his circumstances, began to see patterns. Technology wasn't just the future, it was the future of survival. He started small. Using the little change he had, Mark bought old smartphones from flea markets, fixed them, and resold them online. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to buy more tools, better equipment, and eventually, a computer. Slowly, Mark built his business, starting with repairs and upgrades, then venturing into buying and selling tech at scale. He knew how to market, how to source, and most importantly, he understood what people wanted. Months turned into years, and Mark's business grew. He moved out of the shelter and into a small apartment. From there, he began to expand, leveraging his growing network and the knowledge he had gained from both failure and perseverance. Mark became known in the tech world for his sharp mind and unorthodox methods. People began to trust him again, not because of his past wealth but because of his drive and tenacity. Eventually, Mark's company became one of the most successful in the tech industry. He had gone from being a man with nothing to a man with everything. His rise was slow, methodical, and built on the very lessons he had learned while sleeping on the streets. He no longer cared about the mansion or the luxury cars, instead, he focused on creating technology that would change the world. But his story wasn't just about business, it was about redemption. Mark had become a symbol of what could be achieved when you refuse to give up, when you use your failures as stepping stones. His comeback was inspiring, and it wasn't just about wealth, it was about the human spirit, the ability to rise from the ashes. And as Mark stood at the top once more, looking out over the city that had once seemed so far away, he knew that his journey wasn't over. It was only the beginning. There were still challenges to face, innovations to create, and lives to change. Mark Williams had gone from homeless to billionaire, not through luck, but through hard work, resilience, and an unwavering belief in his ability to rise again. And now, he was ready to share his story with the world, hoping that his journey would inspire others who found themselves in the darkest of places, to know that no matter how far you've fallen, there's always a way back to the top. As Mark's empire grew, so did his understanding of the world around him. The lessons he had learned on the streets, about people, desperation, and perseverance, weren't just valuable in the business world, they were essential in shaping the way he ran his company. His approach was different from others in Silicon Valley. While most CEOs focused solely on profits, Mark focused on people. How technology could improve lives, how companies could give back to communities, and how he could help others avoid the same fate he had suffered. His business wasn't just a tech company, it was a movement. Mark made it a priority to hire people who had been overlooked, those who had fallen through society's cracks, just as he once had. Many of his employees had once been homeless or struggling with addiction, and Mark knew that with the right support, they too could rise. But not everything was smooth sailing. As his success continued, so did the challenges. Old enemies surfaced, people who had once trusted him and watched him fall. They were now attempting to sabotage his reputation and tear down the empire he had spent years building. They underestimated him, thinking he was a man defined only by his past. What they didn't realize was that Mark had become a master of resilience, using every obstacle as fuel to push further ahead. One evening, after a long day of meetings and strategy sessions, Mark sat in his office, reflecting on how far he had come. The city skyline stretched out before him, glowing with possibility. But something felt off. There was a nagging sense that his past, the part of him that had once been shattered, wasn't fully behind him. It was then that he received a call from an old acquaintance, someone he hadn't heard from in years. It was Jake, his former business partner, the one who had led him into the disastrous investment that cost him everything. The voice on the other end of the phone was familiar, but the words were sharp. "Mark," Jake said, "I know what you've become. But I also know the price of your success. I have something you might want to hear. You won't be able to escape it this time." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He knew what Jake meant. His rise from the streets had left a trail of unfinished business, a web of unresolved conflicts that could one day come back to haunt him. "Let me meet you," Mark replied, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "Tell me what you want." The meeting was set. It was to take place in an old diner in the city, the kind of place Mark used to frequent during his darkest days. As he walked in, the smells of grease and coffee filled the air, reminding him of a life he'd long left behind. Jake was sitting in the corner booth, looking much older than the man Mark remembered. There was a heaviness to his eyes, a sign that the years hadn't been kind to him either. Mark took a seat across from him, and they exchanged brief pleasantries before the conversation turned to business. "You've done well for yourself, haven't you?" Jake said, leaning forward. "But you think you're the only one who knows how to rise from nothing. You think you're the only one who's learned the lessons of failure. I've been watching you, Mark. You've left a trail, and people will want their share." Mark stayed silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. He wasn't surprised, he had expected this moment to come eventually. The game he had played in the past had always been cutthroat, and in the world he now dominated, power and control were always at stake. "What are you suggesting, Jake?" Mark asked, his tone calm but firm. Jake's grin was laced with bitterness. "I'm suggesting that you don't get to control everything. I've got a few friends, investors, old business contacts, who aren't happy with how you've positioned yourself. They think you've stepped on too many toes. You think you've got the whole city on your side. Think again." Mark's heart raced, but he remained composed. "You think I'm scared of you, Jake? Or your friends? I've faced worse than you in my life. And I've learned that there's nothing more powerful than the truth." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. Jake looked at Mark, and for the first time, he saw the depth of the man before him, the same man who had once been broken, but now stood unshaken by the threats of his past. "Let's just say, Mark," Jake said slowly, "that the past is never really gone. You might be living your dream now, but it's only a matter of time before it all catches up with you." Mark leaned back in his seat, staring at Jake with a calm resolve. "If there's one thing I've learned," Mark said, "it's that the past can't define me. You may have played a part in my downfall, but you didn't create me. I did. And whatever happens next, I'll rise above it." Jake smirked, his eyes narrowing as he stood up to leave. "We'll see, won't we?" As Mark watched him walk out, he knew that the real battle wasn't over. His success, his rise from the streets, had come at a cost. And now, as he stood on top of his empire, the ghosts of his past were closing in. But Mark wasn't afraid. He had come this far by fighting for what he believed in. And no matter what Jake or anyone else tried to throw at him, Mark would never stop fighting. The world hadn't seen the last of him yet. The days after his meeting with Jake were tense. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, a storm on the horizon that he wasn't fully prepared for. Despite his success, despite the billions he had accumulated, the scars of his past, those days on the streets, the betrayal, the losses, still haunted him. And now, it seemed, his past was reaching out again, trying to drag him back into the darkness. It wasn't just Jake. The whispers were getting louder. Rumors circulated through the business world that Mark's rise hadn't been entirely clean. Some questioned his methods, others his motives. His competitors, who had once quietly watched from the sidelines as he flourished, were now more vocal. They knew that any hint of weakness could take him down. In a world where fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye, Mark was a target. Mark had always believed in his ability to turn any situation around, but this was different. The enemies that were forming around him weren't just business rivals, they were people who had once been his allies. They were people who knew his vulnerabilities, who understood the skeletons in his closet. And they were willing to exploit them. Late one night, as Mark sat in his office, reviewing documents for a new project that could potentially revolutionize the tech industry, he received an unexpected call. It was from an old friend, Samantha, a former colleague and a trusted partner from his early days in business. "Mark, I need to warn you," Samantha's voice was shaky, a tone Mark had never heard from her. "There's a storm coming. Jake. He's not alone. He's made deals with people who have the power to take you down. I don't know how they did it, but they've found a way to undermine everything you've built." Mark's mind raced. Who were these people? How had Jake managed to rally such a force against him? He trusted Samantha, but the depth of this betrayal was something he hadn't prepared for. "I need to know everything, Samantha," Mark said, his voice sharp. "What are they planning?" "I don't have all the details yet," she replied. "But they are targeting your company's foundation, your investors, your board, everything. It's not just about money anymore. They want to destroy your reputation. They want to take everything from you. And I fear they'll do whatever it takes." Mark's thoughts flashed back to the days when he was on the streets, when he had nothing left to lose. Back then, the fight had been for survival. Now, the stakes were even higher. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for everything he had worked for. His employees, his legacy, the people who had helped him build this empire. They were all at risk. But Mark wasn't the same man who had once crumbled under the weight of failure. He had learned that in business, as in life, there were always ways to fight back. He couldn't let fear dictate his actions. Instead, he would turn this threat into an opportunity to prove that no one, not even those who had once been close to him, could take him down. He hung up the phone and stood up, his mind already working through the possible moves. He would need to be strategic. He would need to be bold. And most importantly, he would need to be prepared for whatever was coming next. In the following days, Mark quietly began to shore up his defenses. He started meeting with his trusted advisors, ensuring that every aspect of his company was protected. He reached out to his investors, assuring them that he was aware of the threat and had a plan in place. He didn't show fear. He wasn't going to give Jake and his allies the satisfaction of seeing him falter. But as he dug deeper into the situation, Mark discovered something chilling. The people Jake had aligned himself with weren't just business moguls, they were connected to powerful figures in law enforcement, in politics, and in the media. They had the resources to launch a full-scale attack on Mark's reputation, to twist the truth and make him appear as a villain in the eyes of the public. This was more than just a business dispute. This was a war for his very identity. Mark realized that to survive this, he couldn't just rely on his company's strength. He would need to fight on all fronts: public relations, legal battles, political maneuvering, and, above all, protecting his most valuable asset, his reputation. The following weeks were a blur of sleepless nights, high-stakes meetings, and careful planning. Mark hired the best legal team money could buy, ensuring that any smear campaigns would be swiftly shut down. He brought in top public relations experts to craft a strategy that would turn the media tide in his favor. He also made sure his closest allies knew what was at stake and that they had his back. The media, once a source of praise for his success story, began to turn. The tabloids and online outlets spread rumors questioning his past, suggesting that he had used underhanded tactics to rebuild his wealth. The headlines screamed accusations of fraud, manipulation, and deceit. It was exactly what Mark had feared. But through it all, Mark remained resolute. He knew the truth, and he would make sure the world knew it too. He began to release his own statement, telling the real story, how he had clawed his way back from nothing, how he had faced adversity and come out stronger. Slowly but surely, the tide began to shift. Then came the final confrontation. Jake, now realizing that his carefully laid plans were unraveling, decided to make one last move. He called Mark, his voice dripping with spite. "You think you've won?" Jake said. "You've just delayed the inevitable. You'll fall, just like you did before. People don't forget, Mark. Your empire will crumble." Mark's response was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had been through hell and back. "I've already fallen," Mark said. "And I've come back every time. This time will be no different." With that, Mark ended the call, knowing that the war wasn't over yet, but he was prepared. And this time, he would make sure that he not only survived but thrived, no matter how many enemies tried to tear him down. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. The media onslaught continued, but Mark was ready. He wasn't the naive man he once was, the shadows of his past no longer haunted him as they had before. He had learned how to use adversity to fuel his fire, how to turn the narrative in his favor. This time, the world wasn't going to break him, it was going to witness the culmination of everything he had fought for. Mark's legal team had already begun dismantling the false accusations with a series of strategic countersuits. They filed defamation cases, and the media outlets that had been quick to publish the rumors were now on the defensive. But while the legal battle raged on, Mark knew the real war was about perception. His reputation was under attack, and he needed to prove, once and for all, that he had earned every bit of his success. He decided to take the fight to the people directly. Mark initiated a series of interviews, carefully curated and aired on primetime television. But he wasn't going to let them portray him as a villain, he was going to tell his story in his own words, no spin, no gimmicks. Just the raw truth. The first interview, conducted by a well-known news anchor, aired to millions. Mark sat across from the host, calm and collected, but his eyes reflected a depth of emotion that only those who had been through the darkest times could understand. "I've been called a lot of things," Mark began, his voice steady. "Some of them true, some of them lies. But the one thing they can't take from me is the fact that I've lived through it all. From the penthouses to the alleys. And I've learned that when you hit rock bottom, you don't just rise. You fight. Every single day. I didn't build this empire on lies or deceit. I built it on resilience." As Mark spoke, the tone of the interview shifted. It wasn't just about the accusations anymore, it was about the man who had been through it all, who had lost everything only to rebuild it from scratch. Slowly, the viewers began to see him for who he truly was. His story wasn't one of privilege or luck, it was one of survival, grit, and an unyielding will to succeed. The media narrative began to change, and the tide turned in his favor. But even as his reputation began to recover, Jake and his allies weren't backing down. They had too much at stake. The deeper Mark dug into their schemes, the more he uncovered. Jake had been working with a network of powerful investors, some with connections in politics, others in major corporations, who had a vested interest in bringing Mark down. They had seen Mark as a threat to their control over the market, and they had underestimated his ability to fight back. But Mark had something they didn't, he knew the value of loyalty. His employees, the ones who had been with him through the toughest of times, stood by him. The small tech startup that he had built from the ground up had grown into a force to be reckoned with. The people who worked for him weren't just employees, they were a team, a family, bound together by a shared vision of success. And they were willing to go to war for him. One evening, as Mark reviewed the final pieces of his strategy, he received a call from one of his closest allies, Derek, the CEO of a rival tech firm that had always kept a close eye on Mark's rise. "I've got something," Derek said, his voice tinged with urgency. "Jake's group, they are moving fast. They are trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover. If they succeed, everything you've built will be at risk. We need to move, and we need to move fast." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had anticipated this move, but the timing was critical. This wasn't just a business maneuver, it was a battle for everything he had worked for. "Tell me what you need," Mark replied, his voice hard with resolve. "We've got a window," Derek said. "But we need to take them by surprise. I've got the leverage to pull in a few of our biggest investors. But we need to hit them where it hurts." Mark thought for a moment. He couldn't let Jake and his allies win, not after everything. He couldn't just protect his company, he had to destroy the foundation of their attack before it even started. He made the decision then and there, he would launch a counterattack so powerful, it would not only save his empire but dismantle Jake's plans piece by piece. He immediately convened a war room of his most trusted executives. They strategized for hours, making contingency plans, securing crucial partnerships, and preparing a media blitz that would expose Jake's underhanded tactics. Mark wasn't going to let the truth be overshadowed by lies any longer. The next few days were a blur of non-stop action. Mark and his team began gathering evidence, everything from financial records to insider information that linked Jake's group to illegal activities. It wasn't just about business anymore, it was about survival, and Mark wasn't going to play fair. He knew that in order to protect everything he had built, he had to be ruthless. When the day of the counterattack arrived, Mark was ready. He called an emergency meeting with his investors, laying out the evidence against Jake and his allies. He didn't ask for their support, he demanded it. He made it clear that this wasn't just about money, it was about taking a stand, about protecting what was rightfully his. By the end of the day, Mark had secured the backing of the most influential investors in the industry. The tide was shifting once again. Jake's group was cornered. They had no more leverage, no more allies. The walls were closing in on them. But Mark wasn't done. He wanted to make sure Jake knew that he had lost, not just in business, but in everything. He arranged for a public statement to be released, exposing every detail of Jake's manipulations. The media, once again, turned in his favor. Jake's reputation began to crumble under the weight of his deceit. Mark had won. But the battle had come at a cost. As he looked out over the city skyline that night, reflecting on everything he had been through, he knew that the war for power and influence was never truly over. There would always be new enemies, new challenges, and new obstacles. But he had learned something invaluable: no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back. And as long as he had the strength to fight, he would never stop rising. Months passed, and Mark's victory became the stuff of legends. The media that had once vilified him now hailed him as a true symbol of resilience, a man who had risen from the streets to conquer the highest echelons of business, only to fight back when those who sought to destroy him had come knocking. His story was shared in boardrooms, classrooms, and on social media, becoming an inspiration to millions around the world. Jake, on the other hand, was left with nothing. His empire crumbled as the evidence of his fraudulent dealings came to light, and he was forced into hiding. The investors who had once backed him now distanced themselves, their names dragged through the mud by association. For all his manipulation and scheming, Jake's downfall was swift and final. He had underestimated Mark and his unrelenting drive, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had once seemed invincible. As for Mark, his business not only survived, it thrived. He expanded into new industries, built new partnerships, and cemented his reputation as one of the most formidable businessmen of his generation. But more than that, Mark had reclaimed his life. He no longer defined himself by his past struggles. He had transcended them, not through the money he had amassed, but through the lessons he had learned and the strength he had discovered within himself. He often reflected on the long road that had brought him here. The times when he had nothing, when he had felt like giving up, when the world seemed so unforgiving. But through all that, he had found purpose in the struggle. He had learned that the true measure of success wasn't in wealth or power, it was in resilience, in the ability to rise again, no matter how many times life knocked you down. One evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city he had helped shape, Mark received a message from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. It was from Samantha, the woman who had warned him of Jake's plans all those months ago. "I always knew you had it in you," she wrote. "You didn't just win, Mark. You changed the game." Mark smiled to himself, a sense of peace settling over him. He had changed the game, all right, but in doing so, he had also rewritten his own story. And as he gazed out at the sprawling city below, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. There would be new challenges, new heights to climb, but now, more than ever, he was ready. Because for Mark, the fight had never been about money. It had always been about proving that even when everything seemed lost, he could still rise, stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever before. And as long as he had the strength to fight, he knew he would never stop rising. And so, the billionaire who had once been a homeless man, broken and lost, continued to build, continued to rise. Because he had learned that no matter where you start, it's not where you end up that matters, it's how you fight to get there.